Alright guys, so before we even start today, we're going over plants. I know most of you are going to be like, but I don't care about plants. Well, that's uncomfortable for you because we're still going to do two parts of this. Alright, so there's three principal organs of seeds. You're going to have seed plants, roots, stems, leaves. They're going to be your main organs that we're going to be focusing on. So you have the dermal tissue, the vascular tissue, and the ground tissue. Now each of these tissues have a specific function when it comes to the actual plant structures. We'll get to that in a second. So before we even get there, we were talking about the roots. So the roots are the main form of transport. Any transports or transfer between nutrients from the ground and the plant itself will happen here. Also, the roots are the anchoring part. That's why it's so hard sometimes to pull weeds out, because the roots anchor them so deeply into the ground, and it also helps with preventing erosion, which we talked about when we went over sustainability. Then you have the stem, which is most of the support system. The transport systems for nutrients and water will be found here as they go up to the actual flowers or the leaves. They're also the defensive system. If you guys have ever grabbed a stem and started kind of like peeling at it, you'll notice the stem has many layers in it. That's all in order to make sure that the plant itself is protected. Just went over that. Alright, so the leaves, their main function is photosynthesis. Now that's going to be in the second part of this lecture. Remember I said we were going to do this twice. This is just going to be basic structures. Photosynthesis we'll go over in more detail in the next video. We went over this already. So the dermal tissue, think about it like plant skin, because that's basically what it is. So you have a single layer, that's the epidermis, same as your epidermis. It has a waxy coloring on the outside like a cuticle. I already told you guys, if you've ever peeled at a plant, that waxy sticky texture that you see, that's the dermis. Alright, then you have the vascular tissues. When we're looking at a plant, think of it like the nerves and the veins and the arteries of the plant. So this is where you're actually going to get the nutrients and the water going straight through the plant. So we have two major things we're going to focus on. The xylem. So the xylem has tracheids. When they mature, the tracheids basically die off. So you only have their cells. So the xylem actually has dead cells lining the outsides of the walls, whereas the phloem, which we're going to go over that in a second, is going to actually have live ones. This is going to be for your nutrients to go through. So the phloem, like I said, they have their cells which are alive the entire time. So these are live cells that help the water go in and out of the plant. So for transpiration, you all should have some basic idea of how transpiration happens. So basically it's how the water is pulled through the plant. It gives you an example right here of the water pulling itself up and down. Before we get into too much detail though, I do want to cover one basic thing that I need you guys to understand when it comes to water properties. Alright, so water has cohesive and adhesive properties. So this is a very basic example so that you guys can understand it. Adhesive properties are when water actually attaches itself to the borders or anything basically that's not itself. Cohesive properties are when they grab onto themselves. So that's what we're going to see when we're looking at transpiration. Not only will the water molecules grab at each other, kind of like when you guys suck on a straw, you're not getting one droplet, you're getting a whole stream of water. That's because it's attaching not only to the straw but to itself, and it's pulling itself up the straw. It's the same way that it happens with transpiration. So we just went over this. It's the same thing. It's going to be a capillary action as it pulls itself up through the thin walls. Again, the water molecules are going to attach to each other and to the tubes as well, pulling themselves higher with the pressure that it's going to feel. Okay, nutrient transport, I already told you guys. So the nutrient transport is going to work in a similar fashion. It's going to be more like a pressure pump and an active transport. We're going to go through osmosis and active transport later on when we go into cells. All you really need to know is that this is an active pressure caused motion that goes up and down the plant. Now as we go through certain seasons, the actual, what am I trying to say here? So the plant needs will change as the seasons change. Maybe they need the plant in order to become an actual fruit so that the seed distribution can actually happen. Then what you're going to do is put more nutrients into that area so that the actual fruit can form. It stores the nutrients in the roots, it drives it through the actual stem, gives it out through any part of the plant that needs it at any specific time, and that's how you're going to have the nutrients and actual water flowing through the plant. So we already sort of talked about the different types of tissue. We have the ground tissue, produces and stores the sugars, and is actually itself a form of support for the plant. Remember, we have dermal, we have vascular, and we have ground, but our main focus right now is ground because we are talking about nutrients. So there's three types. You have the parenchyma, the parenchyma, and the sclerenchyma. So they're going to be basically determined by the thickness of the cell walls. So the parenchyma cell is going to be the main type of ground cell tissue, as you saw in the slide before, and in this one it has a thin cell wall. It's going to have a large vacuole. Now think vacuoles basically store water, so this is where you're going to have a lot of your water. It's a thin layer of cytoplasm. In the leaves, it contains a lot of chloroplast. So now what's that going to mean? It's going to mean that a lot of photosynthesis is going to happen at this layer. So the parenchyma is going to be a more strong, flexible cell, and it's more for support than anything else. And the sclerenchyma is the thick, rigid part, and it's going to be more for seed coating. It's a very tough layer because it is extremely thick. So now we're going to talk about plant growth and meristems. So meristems are regions of unspecialized cells in the mitosis procedure. Well, cells in which mitosis produces new cells that are ready for differentiation. So all this is going to tell you is that this is where cell division is going to happen, where each cell is going to have a specialized job. So what exactly is a meristem? Before we even get into actual meristem, if you've looked at a young tree and if you've seen an older tree, the only thing that really differentiates them is the actual physical structure. They're both going to produce new leaves, and they're still going to look nice, young, and green. Even though they're older, there's not going to be a lot of differences besides the actual physical structure that you're seeing, especially the trunks and the leaves. The meristem itself is a region of unspecialized cells. Same as I said before, they're ready for differentiation. So these are going to be found in places that are going to have rapid growth. Now, where are you going to see that rapid growth? It's going to be at the tip of the stems and the roots. Quick reminder, if I were to carve my name on a tree 5 feet from the ground and I came back 20 years later, my name should still be carved on the tree 5 feet from the ground. The stem of any plant is going to grow upwards, not from the bottom up, but from the top up. Now we went over how they're going to basically be at the tips of the roots and the tip of the stem. That's going to be the apex, so that it helps with the growth. That's going to be your apical meristems. So again, they're unspecialized cells, basically just going through rapid cell division in order to increase the length, because again, the roots are going to be the main system for nutrients, and you do want to make sure that your plant is growing in order for it to receive the proper amount of sunlight which it needs to produce any other form of sugars or nutrients in order for it to stay alive. So we talked about how they have an unspecialized job so far. Again, this is just for growth. Once the cells actually mature enough and the area is mature enough, then they start getting their own specialized structure and function to help them get a specific differentiated job. So you're basically going to say, hey, you were nothing before, why don't you become in charge of the actual transfer of nutrients? Again, as everything matures, it starts getting more of a function. Alright, so going over stem structure and function, we've basically covered the stem structure, or at least the basics of it already. Now the functions we've touched upon: stems produce leaves, branches, flowers. Again, they're made to hold everything up so that everything is facing the sun, because again, you do need the sun in order to create certain nutrients that plants need in order to stay alive. They are also there for protection as well as transfer of certain nutrients throughout the entire plant. No matter what your plant is, no matter what your stem looks like, they all have a basic function, but they may vary in the size, the shape, and the way that they actually develop. A potato's stem is not going to look the same as a bamboo shoot. So even though they look weird, overall the function is the same. I'm going to let you guys go over that on your own. Now, there is going to be two different types of plant that we're going to label. You're going to have your monocot plants and your dicot plants. You'll see for the most part, the dicot plants actually have their tissue at these cross sections more organized than the monocot. The monocot already just looks like a chocolate chip cookie, whereas this one actually has a pattern circling the outside. And this is just the actual anatomy of the stem. So the vascular bundles and the ground tissue and the epidermis, they're not going to look exactly the same. Dicots are a little more organized when it comes to their actual structure, whereas monocots are just kind of like, hey, it works. You're going to see another difference also in the way the buds are set up. Oops. Yeah. I'll give you guys an actual image in a second so that it's easier for you guys to see the difference. Let me just pull that up for you. So you'll see it here. The monocots are scattered vascular bundles. Dicots are arranged in a ring. When you're looking at the seeds, you'll also see it has one cotyledon, and this one will have two. If you look at the flowers, this one will have multiples of 3. The monocots multiples of 3. And the flowers for the dicots will have multiples of 4 or 5. So the mature leaves in monocots, you'll see that they're parallel veins, so they'll be straight lines, whereas the dicot ones will have branching off. There's also a difference in the root. Dicots have tap roots, the other ones do not. They spread out a little more. And there's some basic examples for you if you guys need to see it. So this will be your monocot versus dicot little cheat sheet that you guys can refer to whenever you need to. So I kind of skimmed over this while we were looking at dicot versus monocot. So while the stem grows, it creates this kind of node. So you'll see them here on the actual stems. From those nodes, you're actually going to have leaves attached to them. And the buds containing the apical meristems will actually produce either new leaves or new stems. So as they get bigger, you're going to see a whole bunch of more leaves and stems coming from that. So if you notice on your actual notes, I kind of skimmed over the leaf. I didn't really want to go into too much detail until we actually get to photosynthesis. But I do think it is important that you guys understand that the actual gas exchange where they take in CO2 and release O2 happens in the leaf, specifically in the stoma. So the stoma is this opening in the leaves, tiny little opening that has the guard cells around it. So what happens is these guard cells on the outside will puff up with water, open up, and that will cause the gas exchange. Now, it doesn't come for free. When the stoma opens in order to give off the gas exchange it needs in order to go through photosynthesis, it loses water. Now, this may be fine for some plants, maybe here in Florida, but it won't be as great if you're in the desert and you're a cactus. So all of these plants have adapted their own form of adaptations to prevent the gas exchange and water loss from being too drastic. So if I need to have a gas exchange, but I cannot afford to lose the water I have in the middle of the day because I'm in the desert, perhaps my stoma will open later on. So every plant is different. Every environment calls for a different adaptation. Just be aware that this is basically where the gas exchange is going to happen. Now, what happens when I decide that I am done with my gas exchange because I no longer want to lose any more water? The water will actually, the guard cells will kind of shrivel up and close, and then that will be the end of the gas exchange. Now, how are you going to be losing water from the actual stoma? Again, transpiration, we talked about how water kind of leaks out together because they're pulling at each other. That's going to happen, and if you lose too much water, then your plants start to wilt, which means your cells will also basically be useless because they don't have the water they need to maintain living. Now, flowers. We haven't really touched upon any form of flowers yet. Flowers are reproductive organs basically composed of 4 specialized leaves. You have the sepals, the petals, the stamens, and the carpels. We're going to get into each and every one of these in a second. So this is your overall labeled flower. It's going to be divided into basically quote-unquote girl parts and boy parts. If you see ovary, obviously the pistil is going to be the female part, the stamen is going to be the male part. We're going to get through it in a second. First, we're going to start with the anthers. It's a very bad image, especially because we're kind of having the words over it, but the anthers are going to be this part right here. This is where you basically have the pollen. So this is where you're going to have the pollen transfer, and this is where it's all produced. Now, some of you may have allergies to pollen. For lack of a better words, that means you are allergic to plant sperm. Alright, now when we go more into the inner part of the flowering area, you have the carpel, which basically is the female part. It's where you get the gametophytes and seeds. It's going to have your ovaries and any form of eggs or anything coming in from there. You also have the stigma, which is there to capture pollen. Now, why would you need to capture pollen if you yourself produce pollen? Now, we kind of went over this when we went over evolution. You want to increase diversity. Now, can a plant self-pollinate? Yes. Does it want to? Absolutely not. You want to make sure that you're getting pollen from somewhere else. The goal is to make sure that you have healthy offspring. And remember, we do not want to magnify any issues any species may have. While cross-pollination will always be available to it, the plant will do anything it can in order to not self-pollinate. It is not favorable at all. Alright, I went back a little just so that we can move the actual plant so you guys can see the words. So the plant that we went over is angiosperm. It's an angiosperm flower. There are different types of flowers. Not all of them will look like this. So the sepal... Hang on my computer first for a second. So the sepal is going to be that part right here, which basically is going to enclose the little bud that you're going to have here. So as it develops, it kind of comes off as a small protective barrier. You guys probably have seen those little budding flowers before you actually see the petals and the flowers. That's it. So again, I told you guys that no plant wants to self-pollinate, so now how are we going to prevent self-pollination from happening? You're going to make yourself the cutest, prettiest thing you can in order to get pollinators, so butterflies, bees, birds, anything you can to get those pollinators attracted to you so that there can be a transfer of pollen. That's what you're going to look like. So the flowers you see, they're not just cute to be cute, they're cute because they have to be. Now that basically wraps up this first part, and the next part will be up in a second. It's going to be all about photosynthesis. Yay!